Goedemiddag. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good? Alrighty. Well, welcome to Talk Over Text, Conversational Interface, Design, and Usability. First off, how many people have a conversational interface at home? Whether it's a voice assistant, like Google Home, Amazon Echo, something like that. Quite a few of you, okay. And how many of you have experienced frustration when you use it? Yes, we all know that feeling. So I know that Sally just said a few words. I want to introduce myself and say hartelijk welkom. Ik heet Preston So. Ik ben directeur van onderzoek en innovatie bij Acquia, het softwarebedrijf. En ik ben ook directeur van Acquia Labs, ons innovatielab. In Engels, in English, I am Director of Research and Innovation at Acquia, as Sally mentioned, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I have a hashtag, #TalkOverText, if you want to ask questions or post some commentary about this session. There's my contact information if you would like it. As I mentioned, I also lead our Acquia Labs division, which is Acquia's innovation lab. And we do really cool work with emerging technologies like conversational experiences. One thing I want to mention is if a lot of these topics are interesting to you, things like augmented reality, virtual reality on Drupal, things like decoupled Drupal, JavaScript, headless Drupal, we have a conference coming up in August in New York City. I invite all of you to come. It's going to be a really good time. It's our second year, actually, doing this conference, and we're going to have a lot of people giving some really amazing sessions. Our session call for papers is actually still open for at least another week, so please do feel free to submit a session about anything related to decoupled Drupal or JavaScript. Doesn't even have to be about Drupal. It could be about JavaScript, and it could also be about new front-end implementations. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. What I want to start off with is to talk about what's in a conversation. What exactly does it mean when we say conversational interface? I also want to talk about what it means when we talk about conversational content. Because oftentimes, a lot of the conversational interfaces that we work with on a day-to-day basis are very different from the kinds of tools that might be useful in an informational way. I want to talk about four different things that are most important and most essential to any conversational design implementation, which means the information architecture, the design, the content strategy, and of course, the most important, user experience and usability. I'll also briefly go over a case study that my team at Acquia Labs built for the state government of Georgia in the United States, and talk about some of the challenges and some of the things that we learned in the process. And then finally, I want to talk about what exactly conversational interfaces and conversational content will have as a role in our omnichannel world. Content has been changing quite a bit over the last few years, and the ways in which we experience and work with many of the brands and organizations on a day-to-day basis that are figments of our life have changed quite a bit in recent years. Number one, we have wearables. We have things that we take along with us, like Apple Watches and Fitbit devices, that serve us data and serve us content in a very different way from what we're used to on a mobile device or on a computer. We also have digital signage, which also is very different from the standpoint of what kind of content and what kind of data can you serve through these large experiences, these large digital billboards. We also have augmented reality now as well, a contextual experience that allows us to really feel like we're experiencing and consuming this data and this content within the context of our experience. And then, of course, we have voice assistants and conversational interfaces at large. The Amazon Echo is really one of the first true examples of what's called a zero user interface. And the simplest definition of a zero user interface is an interface that does not require any physical or visual component at all, which means there's no keyboard, there's no mouse, there's no screen. It's all oral, and it's all vocal, and it's all based on audio. Erica Hall wrote a very interesting book called Conversational Design. I highly recommend it. It's a very, very fascinating look onto how conversational interfaces should be designed and how they should work. And I really wanted to call out this particular quote, because if there's one takeaway I want for all of you to have from this session, it's this, which is that fundamentally all of the interfaces that I've just mentioned, wearables, when it comes to augmented reality, these are all new. These haven't existed before. But conversation is not actually a new interface. It's the oldest interface. We have been speaking to each other for millennia using various languages and expressing our thoughts and expressing our emotions and our feelings to each other. So we should be able to make sure that our interfaces that we're building and that we're designing fit into those same exact paradigms. Now, how do we go from the process of bringing interfaces to a screen and bringing interfaces to our devices over to a zero-user interface like a conversational interface? Let's think about, first of all, the key component of any conversational interface, which is the intent, the purpose of your opening that interface and what it is that you want to accomplish. In this case, I want to order a pizza, and that's something that's very common. I know many of you also order pizzas, I hope, at least. And oftentimes we're going to use things like a keyboard and mouse on the computer. We're going to use an application like Pizza Hut's app, for instance. But when we want to order a pizza through a conversation, we usually pick up the phone and we make a call. And the conversation that takes place can be very organic and very different from any way that we use these other interfaces to order the same exact thing. And this is really the fundamental aspect of a conversational interface. And conversational design at its core is really about making sure that you are designing and crafting an interface that's not noticeable at all, that actually gets out of the way. Because when you think about it, all of the screens and all of the keyboards and all of the mice that we use on a daily basis and these phones that we use, these are all pieces of technology that we've developed. We've had to actually learn as humans how to use these pieces of technology. They're artificial. They're not natural. But conversation we've learned since as early as 6 months, 12 months old. And as a result, we want to make sure that having a conversation with a device is just as organic and just as natural. So what exactly is involved in conversational interfaces? Well, there's two different kinds of conversational interfaces that I think are probably the most common today. And those are chatbots and voice assistants. Chatbots, of course, include things like text bots on SMS. They include Facebook Messenger bots, Slack bots, the things that we use on a day-to-day basis in our jobs. But voice assistants, on the other hand, are actually mono-channel. And what I mean by that is that they're reliant on a single piece of hardware. Whereas chatbots can feasibly be used on any device. If you think about Facebook Messenger, for example, or Slack, you can use those tools on any device that you want to. But what's interesting is that increasingly we're seeing a lot of abstraction above this layer, this base layer, where people are finding that we should actually be building things that are device agnostic and messenger agnostic and interface agnostic to allow for us to build interfaces that can stretch across all of them. So I can have a single application that I apply using a framework such as any of these that you see on the screen, Dialogflow, Amazon Lex, and so on and so forth, to actually serve both purposes. Here are a few examples of conversational interfaces. We all know about these. Google Assistant is probably the one that's been gaining the most attention recently. But these actually fall into a very interesting spectrum because, to be very honest with you, there are certain devices and certain tools that are much easier to program for or to customize than some of the others that you might see. And it's interesting because I've had many requests from folks, hey, what would it look like to build something like a Siri application, a custom Siri interface? The fact of the matter is, Apple has that pretty much locked down. And so we're really relying on more flexible APIs, more extensible APIs like Amazon Echo or Google Home to really program and design these conversational interfaces. There's also a very big difference between what I call transactional conversations and informational conversations. Let's take the example of a theoretical, hypothetical pizzeria called Pizza Utrecht. Here, maybe it's close to Utrecht Central, and you pass by it on the way here. A transactional conversation is really about placing an order or getting something out of your interaction with that interface. Whereas an informational conversation is really more about learning a new idea or a new concept or learning something new about whoever it is that you want to actually learn about. So when we think about these two different types of conversations, they're actually very different. And we can't think about them the same way. And that's one of the big points I want to make, is that designing a transactional conversational interface where you're really trying to purchase something or check something or order something is very different from getting information from such an interface. And as you can see, there's certain things that can be different when it comes to actually fulfilling the demands that a user is placing on your interface. If you have an intent or if you have a question that needs answering, those two things will be fulfilled, but the way in which the interface actually fulfills that request is very different. Here's another example where you can see that I'm actually not necessarily, when I buy tickets, asking about information. All I want to do is buy tickets to climb Domtore on, let's say, tomorrow or the next day. But I have a friend, actually, who might be wondering more about some content or some information related to some of the works that might be in a museum. And so this gives you an idea of how these two interfaces, these two types of interfaces, have to be considered very differently from a design perspective. So when we talk about conversational content, we're talking about informational interfaces. We're not talking about transactional interfaces. We're talking about how do we actually learn more information from what we have. And to do this, to illustrate this difference, what I want to do is to show you a really interesting demo video that goes into the spectrum of both of these things, kind of straddles both of these extremes.
Have you ever had trouble crafting the perfect menu for a dinner party, or have just been too busy to put one together? Shane is swamped at work. Her Friday is packed with back-to-back meetings when she suddenly realizes that she invited her friends over for a barbecue tomorrow, and she doesn't know what food she's going to prepare. She opens the app for her favorite supermarket, Fresh Market, and taps on Chat Now with FreshBot. She's heard FreshBot makes it quicker and easier to shop for exactly what she needs, but she's never tried it. FreshBot says hi. Shayna interacts with FreshBot, which asks her questions to figure out exactly what she needs for her event, like what kind of meal it is and how many people will be there. FreshBot uses an interaction model to know what questions to ask, like if anyone has any dietary restrictions. Thanks to FreshBot's reminder, Shayna remembers that her friend Ali recently became a vegetarian. Almost instantly, FreshBot sends her a list of recipes drawn from a database on the Fresh Market Drupal site. Some entrees, some sides, and Shayna's pretty impressed. This barbecue's gonna rock. She decides to check out the hamburger recipe to see how many steps there are to make it, so the app serves the recipe content directly from the Fresh Market Drupal site. FreshBot asks her if she wants it to put together all of the ingredients into a handy shopping list. Shayna, realizing she only has time to stop by Fresh Market tonight after work, says yes. FreshBot stores her selected recipes on the website for later. After grabbing coffee, Shayna goes back to work at her desk. Just as she's about to leave work, Shayna decides to take a look at how long that shopping list is before she heads to the store. She goes to the Fresh Market website where she's logged into her account. Shayna goes to her My Shopping List page, where she sees all the ingredients from the recipes automatically pulled into one convenient list. She's pretty happy with the length of the list, so she shuts her laptop and makes her way out the door. Off to Fresh Market.
So what's interesting about that experience is that it has both what I would call transactional and informational components, right? You want to learn about a particular item that you want to cook. That's information, that's content. It's a recipe. It's something that doesn't necessarily involve a transaction. But when you're actually asking a device, help me plan this dinner party, help me actually figure out what I need to do for these guests, that's much more transactional because you're actually getting something out of it. So I really want to focus on the conversational content case because how many of you work with CMSs? WordPress, Drupal, yes, pretty much everybody, and that's the reason why you're here. One of the things that we are really concerned about at Acquia Labs is how exactly can we marry some of the ideal scenarios that we have in content management and in CMSs, some of the things that we really take for granted when it comes to Drupal and WordPress, and apply those ideas to a conversational perspective as well. Right now, if you think about web content and spoken alternatives. If you're building something for users of assistive technologies, if you're building something to be accessible, right now the user experience is pretty tough. And in the early 2000s and early on, a lot of these websites would have text-to-speech services. You could call a hotline and get certain web pages read back to you over the phone. And these still exist today, by the way. But having a whole web page read to you is kind of like having someone read Anna Karenina to you or a different long novel to you and not being able to really have a sense of when that should start and stop. And screen readers are kind of in the same bucket, where a lot of people have written web content in a way that makes using screen readers really tough. How many people here have installed a screen reader on their browser, like Chromevox, an extension, to see what it's like for people who are using screen readers? It's a really interesting content strategy exercise, because when you think about how you create content and how you write content, and you think about the fact that someone's eventually going to have to listen to this content being read, it really changes your perspective. And if you think about these small links and these things that we offer screen readers users, like skip to main content or skip navigation, those things actually, in some ways, and oftentimes hamper the experience. And both of these suffer from what I call a low verbosity tolerance, which means that you can be listening to it for 15 minutes and your eyes glaze over because you're not really able to keep a long attention span and pay attention to what's going on. So when we think about conversational content and we think about what is the ideal way to craft content in a conversational context, we have to move away from the paradigms that we're used to on the web. On the web, we usually have things like screen-based long-form prose, which means that if I'm reading a news article, I can scroll through it, I can skim through it, I can skip pieces of it, and there's no problem because I can always jump back if I forgot what I was reading before. It's a physical and visual interface. It's a very interactive interface, which means that I have to make sure that I can put things on the screen where I want to see them based on what I would like to be looking at. Web-based content typically has a lot of links and references and different places that you can go to, and that's something that is very unique to the web and is one of the most fundamental principles of the web, of course, linked pages. And it also has a high verbosity tolerance. Oftentimes we spend hours reading Wikipedia articles that could be 50 pages long when printed out, and that's not an issue at all for us. But in a conversational perspective, we have to rethink the way that we write content and the way that we think about content. But it's not necessarily just about conversational content. It's about all of the different kinds of content that we want to deal with. And conversational content really revolves around the zero interface that I just mentioned, this idea that we have these short utterances, these short statements that are very limited. Very few links and references. You can't say read more, for example, on a conversational interface that's a voice assistant, for example. And it has a very low verbosity tolerance. You're not going to want to hear something for 15 minutes straight if all you need is a piece of information that's in minute 6. So here's an example of how different these two things are. Here's, once again, an example of a pizzeria called Pizza Utrecht. And we have a very nice web page here that tells us about some of the deals that are available. But in a conversational context, this content changes because it could be some transactional components, like you're placing an order and you want to specify the topping, or it could be content, like a quick blog post that somebody wrote last week about the ongoing deals and promotions. So these are all aspects of conversational content that we have to consider that are unique to this interface and don't necessarily have to do with the web. So conversational content at its core must present information in a comprehensive but efficient way. And that means that if you want to share the exact same content you have on the website in a conversational context, you have to really think about it in a different way. So let's talk about information architecture, because that's one of the things that I think is the most fundamental piece of any conversational design exercise. Normally, when we think about a website and sitemaps, we think about a hub and spoke architecture, which means that, generally speaking, we'll have a navigational hierarchy. There's an about section, a menu page, an order page, a where we are page that helps us navigate through this website. And it could be that we have a menu page that's a sub-item, a landing page, and then underneath that, we have pages that are actually inaccessible unless you go to the menu page, like doner, capsalon, and pizzas. So this kind of architecture is something that's very unique to the web. It's something that we don't really find anywhere else. And the way that we actually create nav bars and the way that we actually create navigational tools for our websites really reflects this. it's very tough to imagine being able to take this exact same hierarchy and turning it into a conversational interface. It requires us to think about this in a very different way. Oh, and by the way, if anyone doesn't know what kapsalon is, it's the best thing that's come out of the Netherlands since Fabo. So, now, in a web-optimized information architecture, we can see the structure of everything. It's right there in front of us. We don't really need to dig into a hierarchy and learn a new structure for how things work. But in a conversation-optimized information architecture, the structure has to actually be given to us. We have to be provided with what it is that the structure looks like. So here's an example. A conversational navigation tool would be something like this, where you have two tiers, and you have a bot, a chatbot, or an Amazon Echo, or a Google Home say, welcome to Pizza Utrecht. Here are some options, just like you would on a phone hotline, for instance. And then it might offer you certain things on the second level. Once you go to the About page, then you might have access to certain informational intents, like learning about the team, learning about the story of this pizzeria, getting information about the menus. Do you have gluten-free options? Do you have halal options? And of course, there are certain components, as you can see on the bottom, that wouldn't work in this context. You can't show a map on a voice assistant. You just can't. You can show it on a chatbot, but you can't show it on an Amazon Echo. So information architecture from a conversational standpoint requires guided unidirectional flows, single tracks, not sitemaps, not navbars. You can mimic the navbar in a conversational interface, but it cannot act in the same way. Now let's talk a little bit about design. And this is where I want to take a big step back, because you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's great, but that means that we're very limited in terms of what we can do with the design of this, because normally I'm used to working in InVision and doing visual prototypes and making mock-ups and doing comps. How does this actually work if I'm a designer wanting to get into conversational design? There's a scholar named Paul Grice, and this is somebody who was mentioned, by the way, in Erica Hall's conversational design book, who came up with 5 conversational maxims. And these maxims are core to every single conversation that we have. It's part of what's called the cooperative principle, which means that when you and I enter into a conversation, and you and I want to get something out of each other in terms of some kind of new piece of information, or something new that we want to learn about each other, there are certain things that we have to make sure that we rely on, that undergird every single part of our conversation. An example of this is quantity. You don't want to provide too much information. You don't want to hear me go on too long about how much I love Fabo when you're actually here to learn about conversational design. Quality, being truthful. The information that you provide has to be something that's not deceptive. You don't want to actually disorient somebody or distract somebody from their actual goal and the thing that they want to accomplish in a conversation. Being relevant is another thing. Oftentimes, when we're on our phones, we can move off of our tracks of conversation and have to come back, and we need to make sure that what we're saying to each other is actually relevant. And then there's, of course, manner, which is being brief, orderly, unambiguous. We don't want to introduce any sort of ambiguity, and this is a big problem when it comes to text-based conversations. Was that sarcasm? Was that irony? What exactly did they mean there? And then finally, there's one added by Lakoff, which is politeness, and this is something that I think is very important. Being pleasant and being cooperative and being a good person when it comes to a conversation goes a great length to actually making sure that you are able to feel like this person is invested in the conversation. So Erica Hall, in her book, based on these maxims, outlines 4 key moments of every conversation, and 4 key moments that should be a part of every single conversational interface. And those 4 things are introduction, orientation, action, and guidance. If you want to read more about these, I highly recommend you check out her book. In the introduction, we're really trying to make sure that we're engaging the user, inviting interest, having them trust us, making sure that the interface is something that they feel welcome to. Next, we move on to orientation. We want to give them the ability to know exactly how they can get out, how they can exit, how they can enter into certain system options, and what exactly is available to them to get to their goal from the very beginning. From that point, we move into action, which means we want to give them a set of tasks. We want to give users the ability to have choice and to have control over the transactions that are being performed or the information that's being served. Finally, guidance. Feedback is one of the most important things. You don't want to have a conversational interface when you say something like, I want to order a pizza with 2 toppings, not respond at all or respond with silence. And you also want to be able to provide those instructions as well. Now, as you can see, a lot of this is actually in addition to the content that we might want to serve from a CMS perspective. A lot of this is actually stuff that is going to be wrapped up in the presentational context, which means solely limited and exclusive to the conversational interface itself. In my opinion, in my perspective, there's 2 key components of conversational design. Number 1 is language. How do you write something that is inviting? How do you write something that builds trust? How do you write something that allows someone to feel like they have a set of choices that are easy and straightforward? And I know that some of us might not be good writers, but from a design perspective, in a conversational context, we do have to be good writers. Secondly, decision flows. How do we establish a hierarchy that allows us to traverse different trees or different flows that will get us to our destination and get us to our goal, along with these key moments? Let's go through an example. So, designing language. How is it that we actually introduce our conversational interface? One example that we can take is with Pizza Utrecht. Welcome to Pizza Utrecht. We're happy to serve you today. That's introduction. We are inviting interest. We're helping the user feel like they're at home, even if this is the first time they're using this interface or the 50th time they're using this interface. Secondly, orientation. We want to give them the ability to know exactly what it is that they can do right out of the box. Immediately, we want to say, to order, just say order. If you want to go back at any point, just say back. If you want to exit, say exit. And this is, by the way, based on voice assistant, a voice assistant interface, not necessarily a chatbot interface, which might have different motivations and different stipulations. Next, you might have things like actions, which means I am provided with a choice. I am provided with choices between different things that I can do in response to this task. And then finally, I get feedback. Was that pepper or pepperoni? If it was unclear what I said. And then, of course, we want to actually give people the feeling that they've accomplished something and that they're feeling like they've done something with this interface that they weren't able to accomplish before. So, coming right up. How does this work from a flow perspective? Well, if you think about decision flows, you can think about it like this, where we have these key moments and we want to build off of these key moments, but we also need to make sure that there's the ability to go back and reiterate and constantly have this wayfinding that allows for somebody to go back to a previous step or forward to something else. And that conversation that I just showed you, that sort of interaction that I just showed you, follows this exact form, where you can say back at any time, but also we're going to make sure that we validate the intent, confirm the order, offer something else in the end, and make sure that we follow this structure. And this is actually something that I've used on a whiteboard, and it's worked really well in terms of designing flows and figuring out how it is that we actually want users to interact with our interface. Now, what about the design? And this is really an area that's very interesting because in this context, design and content strategy really merge in a conversational context. And there's 2 things that I really want to call out when it comes to writing or designing conversational content. And the first is what I call content legibility or conversational legibility. Is this a piece of content that is understandable to a listener rather than someone who's reading it? An example of this is that content structured in a certain way tends to lend itself to these types of interfaces. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you should make sure to think about this conversational content that you might be writing as part of a larger, overarching, omnichannel content strategy that's actually agnostic to the experiences that you're building. Here's an example of this. One thing that we've already seen is that a website copy is really bad for conversation. And it could be that we only need 2 sentences or 2 very short pieces of information to welcome the user into this interface. And we don't need this long form article. And maybe we actually notice that that's something that works on the website too. Or maybe it's something where we have a summary field in Drupal, for instance, that we provide instead of the actual long form body text. When it comes to short form content, it could be something where we actually have a piece of information that's very limited that we can provide in a conversational way that's already predisposed to this. But probably most of you have thought about conversational interfaces and actually doing an informational conversation from the context of frequently asked questions, or FAQs, where it's very clear that there's a back and forth and this kind of two-way directionality when it comes to a conversation. The second thing I want to talk about is content discoverability. Because fundamentally, you can have the most legible content ever from a conversational standpoint, and people can listen to it and feel like they are able to have a conversation with it. But if that information or that particular node in your decision flow is not discoverable for users because it's not linked to, because it might be orphaned, that's a big problem. And so the further down you get, as you design your flows, if you go further and further and further down, and you notice that people are not reaching this content that they were able to get to before, or not able to reach this particular transaction that they were able to reach before, that's a big problem. Because as you go further and further down, as we know when we deal with conversions and we talk about marketing language where we really need to make sure that users are part of this funnel, we lose a lot of them, no matter what. The longer that we delay their arrival at their destination, the easier it is that we actually lose them. Let's talk a little bit about user experience. Conversational usability is a very new field and very immature. It's something that we don't really know a whole lot about yet, because a lot of us have really been only using these interfaces for the last few years. And conversational usability is a very poorly understood area right now in usability research because it's oral. It's not visual, it's not physical. We're not using it in the same way that we would think about user interfaces. And this is really true of all interaction design. When you think about the fact that, one of the key aspects or one of the key lessons that you learn as an early usability researcher is things like, on a door, it says push or pull. That's something that gives cues. In a conversational context, that's a totally different cue. It's somebody else over here on the side telling you that you need to push or pull the door. There's no label. There's nothing on the door that tells you anything about how to use it. And so when we think about conversational usability and conversational user experience, we have to think about how it is that people would be using this, not from the perspective of normal interfaces, because all of the things that we've learned up to this point about user experiences and usability testing go right out the window. We can't do things like eye tracking. We can't do things like think aloud in a voice assistant context. Because fundamentally, when you're thinking about something and you actually are talking to a voice assistant, there's no way for you to think aloud at that point. When someone's using a website and trying to navigate a website and is manipulating certain things on the page, that's very easy. You can think aloud. There's going to be something, that's data that you can collect. You can transcribe that, and that's very much data that you should collect. But you can't really do that in a conversational context. You can do that on a chatbot, but you can't really do that on a voice assistant. Similarly, when it comes to eye tracking, that just goes out the window. Heat maps, that goes out the window too. Because now we're really focused on this flow, and this flow becomes our canvas. This flow becomes what it is that we want to map the heat of. So there's a technique that we use in Acquia Labs that is very different from the traditional approaches to usability testing that many people use to conduct research. And it's called retrospective probing. And the reason why we use this is because it allows for the conversational experience to be uninfluenced and unsullied. We can collect good data. Let's just say, for example, that you're building a Google Home interface, and you want to be able to test how that works. You want to actually find out how the user feels about it and get their impressions of that interface after the whole interaction is already done. Because any interruption during the process might trigger the Google Home or insert bad data into your transcript or into your recording. And that's not something you want in a usability study. It has a big disadvantage, though, and that's one thing that we have come up against, which is the fact that retrospective probing does suffer from a key disadvantage, which is that people don't have the best memories. And when you try to ask somebody about their impressions after the fact, what they recollect might be totally different from what they actually had in the experience. And for this reason, for all usability testing that we conduct on voice assistant interfaces, we always have a transcript, an audio recording, and of course, the retrospective questionnaire. In this context, obviously, think aloud and concurrent probing don't work. You can't really ask questions during the process of testing an Amazon Echo skill, because voice assistants can be easily invoked. There can be something that influences the data, and that really leads to false data, and really, those results have to be thrown out. And these only really work in a text-based or a sort of visual, physical text bot interface. So I want to talk about a case study, which is very interesting, that we built as a team at Acquia Labs called Ask Georgia Gov. And Ask Georgia Gov is a really interesting interface. It's the first ever Alexa skill that was built for citizens of the state of Georgia. And it really is interesting because it gives you answers to questions about certain topics. And these can be things like how to renew a driver's license, how to register to vote, or how to enroll a child in pre-kindergarten programs. And even, for example, who Georgia's governor is. By the way, that's Nathan Deal, and the only reason I know that is because I worked on this project. So what I want to do is I want to show a quick video of how it works and show you exactly what this looks like from the perspective of the user, and then I'll talk about how it is that we built it and designed it.
Alexa, ask Georgia Gov.
Welcome to Georgia Gov. Feel free to ask a question.
How do I get my driver's license?
Does this sound helpful? Getting and renewing a driver's license.
Sure.
The Department of Driver Services helps you earn, renew, or replace learner's permits and licenses. To carry a full license for everyday, non-commercial vehicles, you must be at least 16 years old. You'll pay $32 to renew your license for 8 years. You can save $5, however, if you renew your license online.
I just moved. How do I transfer my out-of-state license?
Does this sound useful? I'm a new state resident. How do I transfer my license?
Yes.
To apply for a license, you should schedule an appointment and gather your current out-of-state license, social security number, proof of Georgia residency, bank statements, utility bills, and rental contracts all work, and proof of identity, birth certificates, passports, or immigration ID cards. At the appointment, you'll surrender your former license, pay the license fee, and receive a temporary license. Your permanent license will arrive by mail just a few weeks later.
Give me that phone number.
The number for the Georgia Department of Driver Services is 404-657-9300. If you need that number again, say repeat.
Repeat.
That number again is 404-657-9300. If you have another question, feel free to ask it. Otherwise, you can say exit.
Exit.
Pretty interesting, right? How many of you noticed the Easter egg with Grice's face? Okay, good. That was a inspired touch there. So there were three things that really went into building this, which were, number one, we wanted to get information to citizens a little bit faster. Now, Georgia has a hotline that you can call that has text-to-speech capabilities, which means that you can actually call a hotline, request a page, and have that read back to you. But what they were finding is that people didn't really like using it that much. And people were finding that, they would just rather call the office itself rather than having to navigate through a transcript of a web page. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that we were widening access to information. The state of Georgia has been very innovative and very forward-looking when it comes to accessibility, and we wanted to make sure that all of this information is inclusively provided. And finally, we also wanted to uphold this open source foundation. By the way, in case you didn't know, Acquia Labs and our team maintains the integration module between Alexa and Drupal 8, as well as Drupal 7. So if you go to drupal.org/project/Alexa, you can actually go and see what we've done there and what we've been maintaining. It's all open source. It's available for you to work with. We wanted to build toward a single source of truth for content. Now, one of the biggest issues that Georgia has is that they don't have a whole lot of editorial staff. And a lot of you probably don't have the luxury of having a lot of people that you can rely on when it comes to writing content as well. And so what they knew from the very beginning is that they wanted to keep a single piece of content as the kind of authoritative, canonical piece of content and not have multiple different pieces of content. So basically writing a second conversational experience in terms of content was totally a non-starter. We also wanted to make sure that we mimicked or came very close to the actual structure of the website. And many of you probably were a little bit surprised or are surprised to learn that it is exactly this text that the interface is reading right now. It's exactly what is on the website right now and the content that's available on georgia.gov that is being provided through this interface that's very handy and easy to use. So the way that it's structured is as follows. We have a topic, and the topic is something that is alluded to at the very beginning of the interface. When, for example, my colleague Leah, when she says, I want to renew my driver's license, immediately a search is conducted, and you know that the topic is driver's licenses. So you know that you're on this particular piece of content. The next thing that Alexa says is what you should know, which is this component right here. By the way, this content might be different because there have been some changes to the actual content itself. Then we also have FAQs underneath that. And you could actually access these related questions and these related FAQs through the same exact interface by asking further questions and by getting the answers out of it. So here's how the key moments work in this context. What I've done here is I've color-coded all of these individual moments into a typical conversation with Ask Georgia Gov. It starts out with, welcome to Georgia Gov. Feel free to ask a question. Of course, maybe somebody's driving and they've said something unclear, and we get some feedback back from this skill that says, sorry, I didn't understand. Can you ask me a question related to the state government of Georgia? This builds a great deal of trust at the beginning because we're welcoming the user and we're also orienting them by telling them what it is that they can accomplish at the very beginning. And when they do make some kind of provide a response that we don't actually know how to interpret, we're able to give them feedback that allows them to bounce right back. Then when I actually ask the question, it gives me the ability to confirm or deny this particular thing. It gives me a set of actions that I can perform. Next, I get the information itself, which is the feedback that I wanted, the guidance, the sort of information that I wanted to get from this interface. And then, of course, I can also go on and get more information about this topic as well. And as you can see, there's a whole lot more in this interface that I can do. And at the very end, when I've actually gotten the answer to my question and I've gotten what I need, I can be oriented to saying, well, let's go right back to the beginning and ask a new question, or I can go ahead and exit. So that shows you exactly how this works. And this flow is exactly the kind of thing that we used to map out how this experience would look. This is not exactly a direct copy of what it is that we designed as a team, but it is something that is very interesting from the perspective of what you would, how you might want to map this from a design perspective when you're actually building these decision flows. So for this project, it was very interesting because we wanted to establish two criteria. Number one is we didn't want to give any sort of additional steps to their editorial workflow because when you have a team of maybe 4 or 5 editors, that's a very small team, you don't have time to write 2 different pieces of content. And we also wanted to make sure that for their experience, editing that web-based content would be indistinguishable from a conversational piece of content. So one of the things that we did is we performed a content audit. And this is one of the first times I've ever seen this. I've seen anybody do this. I don't think anyone else has really done this kind of thing where we went through every single piece of text on the website and basically analyzed it and figured out, is this something that is very clear from a conversational standpoint? Number one, we found that making things more contextually specific actually helped the experience because when you don't know what it is that you're doing, you can actually learn more about the information. Also, and get the information that you need, Also, we wanted to make sure that calls to action, link-rich text, some of these references that are not able to be done in a traditional way on a voice interface were things that were put in context. Because when you hear somebody like an Amazon Echo say, you can receive payments, learn more about payments, what does that mean? What am I going to do as a user? I can't learn more about payments. I can't click on that link. I can't click on that PDF. So we contextualize a lot of these links. Here's a really good example of this, where literally we had an answer to a question where it was one sentence and then it said, read more about this. That's really unhelpful to a user who's using an Amazon Echo. You really want to provide the information that they want in that context. So those are examples of how we actually worked with the state of Georgia to really morph this content into things that were able to be consumed from a conversational perspective. And this is the same exact content that's on the website. There is no difference, actually, between the content on the website and the content you get out through your Amazon Echo. And I think that's a very unique thing. I don't think that that's a very common thing that you'll see. We did some user testing as well, by the way. We asked folks to perform some tasks. I wish I could share with you some of these results. They're actually quite funny. But basically what we did is we asked people to try to accomplish a task and to get the phone number at the end and do the things that required them to go all the way through the flow from A to B to C to D. 8 months later, here's a very interesting set of stats. Now, obviously this was an experiment. This was not something that is something that we think is the best interface in the world, because clearly Amazon Echo itself has certain problems and certain issues when it comes to natural language processing, which I'll talk about in a second. But here's a really good kind of stat, which is that we found that anyone who used this interface had a 79.2% success rate on all interactions. Now, for those of you who own an Amazon Echo, how many of you have had a higher rate of success than that on your device? It's pretty rare. Because oftentimes with these conversational interfaces, it's really hard to make sure that you're getting to what you need. And really, I have found actually among all of my friends who own Amazon Echoes that they really kind of react with frustration whenever it doesn't understand. Some of the most popular keywords were vehicle registration, driver's licenses, and of course state sales tax, which is something that we all, these are things that we all care about, anywhere that we're living. And it was very interesting because one final anecdote I want to share before I move to the conclusion is that we had one interesting result. We log all of these results, by the way. The state of Georgia has access to every single utterance that has been said, every single question that's been asked, so they can actually perform analytics and figure out which pages are more popular, which ones they should focus on more. And we kept on seeing this really interesting result that kept on coming up in the logs that was called driver's losses. And it was really confusing to us because we thought, what is that? What is that referring to? As it turns out, if you pronounce driver's licenses in a particularly Georgian way, you get driver's licenses. You get driver's losses, right? And that was something that we actually found was a big flaw, or something that we found was an interesting tidbit from the actual natural language processing that Amazon Echo is able to do. So with that, I want to move into a quick epilogue here and just really delve into a couple of really key messages I want you all to take away. Number one is that conversational interfaces are the most human of interfaces. And what that means is we have to think about them in a human way. We have to think about them as if they're human conversations, as if the interlocutors of these conversations are actually real people. If we're going to build content-based interfaces, informational interfaces, it has to be human-centered. It has to be something that we focus on in terms of how we write it and how we present the language and how it actually flows. And finally, conversational content can't be by itself alongside web content. You can't really maintain a content repository that has many different pieces of content dedicated for every single device in the world. And that brings me to my final point, which is that conversational content really must be part of this larger omnichannel strategy that is agnostic to those experiences. And that's something that we learned through this experience with the state of Georgia. With that, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Preston. We have time for like one or two questions. So the most popular question was actually asking how you feel about, like, most conversations are going to have a lot of things that are imperceptible. So, when we speak, we can see each other's body language, other things like that. Like how, not having that, how does that play into this interface?
It's a very good question. I'm actually a trained linguist. I study linguistics at university, so this is actually a topic that is very near and dear to me. When we talk about communication, we talk about conversations, there is, of course, a very different set of cues and a very different set of things that we understand from people when we're sitting face-to-face to them rather than across a computer screen. And body language, those sorts of things, and physical cues, emotional cues, just sort of the synchrony that you build when you are sitting face-to-face with somebody, that's something that right now conversational interfaces in general, meaning everything, chatbots, voice assistants, cannot provide. There's a lot of work being done right now in terms of trying to figure out how can we learn more about these
kinds of cues and also incorporate them into building user interfaces that work on multiple dimensions, not just the oral, but also the emotional. And there's a lot of work. Actually, I was at South by Southwest back in March, where there was a very interesting session presented by Microsoft Research and someone from Caltech about how it is that we can take data that's brought in from things like facial recognition and detecting how stressed someone might be, where their heart rate is, certain cues like that, and then reacting to that through an interface response. Those kinds of interfaces, these kinds of bodily interfaces that really try to figure out how synchrony works across people, and also that really tries to figure out, sort of from a haptic perspective even, what it is that humans feel and what it is that we can do to respond to them in the most appropriate way is something that we still have a lot of work to do on, because clearly when you open up an Alexa, it has no idea if you're angry or if you're sad or if you're really excited. And those are things that might influence the way that it responds.
Thanks, great answer. So the future is Westworld, essentially. And then one last question. Do you feel this can have a bit of a US-centric workflow? So, for example, when my partner moved to England, he's from Germany. I had to do a lot of training on the word please, because in German that isn't necessary. And so you had the slide about Erica Hall, saying about politeness and stuff. It seems like a lot of these are based around a US view of politeness and everything. Like, is there any work being done to help this in, say, European countries or Asian countries or anything like that?
It's a very good question. Wow, where do I start? Clearly, different languages have different structures when it comes to politeness. I actually was having a conversation last night with somebody who was talking about the difference between Spanish and Dutch when it comes to, how you use the word please. When you say things like alstublieft or alsjeblieft, that word has a very different meaning from por favor in Spanish, for example. And the way that you use it is very different, because when you give someone something, when you give someone some kapsalon, you'll say alsjeblieft, right? But you wouldn't say that in Spanish. And these sorts of things are very interesting from the standpoint of linguistic cues, because oftentimes we have those little phrases that we use on a daily basis that really mirror the culture of where we are. The good thing that I can say is that I believe it was Amazon Echo recently announced that all of these voice assistants, Google Home and Amazon Echo, have capabilities for multilingual interactions. And actually, I believe Google Home just announced they're going to have bilingual interactions, so you can talk to Google Home in both English and German interchangeably. But with Amazon Echo, one of the things that I believe they mentioned, and once again, this might be wrong, I might be getting these two mixed up because it's been a little while, but one of these two is going to be able to provide the ability to accept certain slang or certain phrases that people use that are reflective of how they feel and aren't necessarily things that are, universal. And so that's an example of a case where you'll find that many times when we have these kind of cross-cultural barriers, we can resolve those. However, I think that point that you made is still very much a conflict that we have to resolve, which is when you have languages, especially East Asian languages, that have honorific structures, for example, where you have to address somebody a certain way, or when you have words that have very different nuances in terms of meaning, and they can be interpreted differently, and especially when it comes to non-native speakers of English or non-native speakers of Dutch or German, how do you actually get to the point where you're able to interpret their input as effectively as somebody who is a native speaker of that language? Those are all questions that I hope we will have the answers to in the coming years and decades.
Thank you, Preston. Please give it up for Preston So.
Thank you.